The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle, as Sergeant William Morrison adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be another ordinary day of duty. At 42 years old, William had served the Royal Guard for nearly 2 decades, standing motionless for hours, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication. His weathered hands gripped his rifle with practiced ease, and his stern expression revealed nothing of the storm brewing in his personal life. Behind the castle walls, 7-year-old Prince George was experiencing his own kind of morning routine. Unlike most children his age, his day began with lessons in royal protocol, but today felt different. The young prince had been watching the guards from his bedroom window for weeks, noticing things that adults seemed to miss. He observed how they stood perfectly still regardless of weather, how their eyes never wavered from their posts, and how people walked past them as if they were statues rather than human beings. William's mind wandered to the letter he had received 3 days earlier. His elderly mother, living alone in a small cottage in Yorkshire, had fallen and broken her hip. The doctors said she needed surgery, but more importantly, she needed someone to care for her during the long recovery. As the only child, William felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on his shoulders. His mother had sacrificed everything to raise him after his father died in military service. Now she needed him, but his duties to the crown seemed to make it impossible to be there for her. The conflict between duty and family had been eating away at William's sleep. His fellow guards noticed his distraction, though they said nothing. In the Royal Guard, personal problems were expected to remain invisible. The tradition demanded complete focus on protecting the royal family, no matter what chaos unfolded in their private lives. William had always accepted this until now. Prince George finished his breakfast and convinced his nanny to let him walk through the castle gardens. The boy had developed a fascination with the guards, particularly the one who stood at the east gate. There was something in that guard's eyes that seemed sad, though his expression never changed. The prince had learned to read people's emotions by watching their eyes, a skill his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had taught him before her passing. As Prince George approached the east gate, he could see Sergeant Morrison standing at attention. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees. The prince walked slowly, his small feet making soft sounds on the gravel path. He stopped a few feet away from the guard, studying the man's face with the curiosity that only children possess. William sensed the young prince's presence but maintained his rigid posture. Protocol demanded that he not acknowledge anyone unless there was a direct threat or emergency. However, something about the boy's quiet presence felt different from the usual tourists and visitors who gawked and took photos. The prince wasn't trying to make him break character or testing his resolve. Instead, the child simply stood there, as if he understood something profound about the burden of duty. The prince noticed the guard's hands trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly. Most people would have missed this detail, but Prince George had inherited his great-grandmother's ability to observe human nature. He could sense that this man was struggling with something heavy, something that went beyond the weight of his rifle or the responsibility of his position. For 20 minutes, the prince remained near the guard post, not speaking or trying to distract the soldier, but simply being present. Other palace staff walked by, some nodding respectfully to the young royal, others hurrying past with their daily duties. None of them noticed the silent communication happening between the child and the guard. William found himself strangely comforted by the prince's quiet presence. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever simply stood with him, without expecting anything. There were no orders to follow, no protocols to observe, just a young boy who seemed to understand that sometimes people need someone to stand beside them, even in silence. The prince's nanny eventually called for him, and he had to leave for his morning lessons. As he walked away, Prince George turned back once to look at the guard. In that moment, their eyes met briefly, and William saw something in the child's gaze that he had never expected to see from royalty. Genuine concern for his well-being as a human being, not just as a servant of the crown. Throughout the rest of his shift, William couldn't stop thinking about that brief encounter. The prince had asked nothing of him, demanded no acknowledgement, and expected no special treatment. The boy had simply shared his presence, offering a kind of companionship that transcended the barriers of rank and protocol. It was a gesture so simple yet so powerful that it began to shift something fundamental in William's understanding of service and sacrifice. As evening approached and William's shift ended, he walked back to his quarters with his mind churning. The letter from his mother's doctor lay on his small desk, alongside the resignation letter he had been drafting for 3 sleepless nights. The decision that had seemed impossible just hours earlier was beginning to crystallize in his mind, influenced not by words or commands, but by the quiet wisdom of a 7-year-old prince who understood that true nobility comes from recognizing the humanity in others. The castle bells chimed 8 o'clock, marking the end of another day of royal duty. But for Sergeant William Morrison, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. The young prince's simple act of standing with him had planted a seed of clarity that would soon grow into a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. Sometimes the most profound changes begin not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with a child's quiet understanding that every person, regardless of their role, deserves to be seen as more than just their uniform. The next morning brought a heavy rainfall that drummed against the castle windows like nature's own percussion section. Sergeant William Morrison stood at his post, raindrops sliding down his helmet and soaking through his uniform, but his mind was elsewhere. The previous day's encounter with Prince George had stirred something deep within him, creating ripples of change that he was only beginning to understand. Prince George woke to the sound of rain and immediately thought of the guard at the east gate. During breakfast, he barely touched his porridge, much to his nanny's concern. The boy's mind was occupied with questions that seemed too big for his 7-year-old heart to contain. Why did the guard look so sad? Did he have a family? Was someone he loved in trouble? These thoughts swirled in his head like the storm clouds gathering outside. William's shift had started before dawn, and already his uniform was thoroughly soaked. The rain made everything more difficult. His rifle felt heavier. His boots slipped slightly on the wet stones, and the cold was seeping into his bones. But what bothered him most was the unopened letter from the hospital that had arrived that morning. His mother's condition was worsening, and the doctors were growing more concerned about complications from her surgery. The young prince managed to convince his tutors to move his morning lessons to the library that overlooked the east gate. From the tall windows, he could see the lone figure of the guard standing steadfast in the pouring rain, while his teacher droned on about mathematics and history. Prince George's attention was fixed on the man below, who seemed to embody a kind of quiet suffering that the child instinctively wanted to ease. During a brief break in his lessons, Prince George made a decision that would have shocked the palace staff if they had known about it. He slipped away from his supervision and made his way to the castle's kitchen. The head cook, Mrs. Patterson, had always been kind to him, often sneaking him extra biscuits when his parents weren't looking. She looked surprised when the young prince appeared in her domain, his formal clothes slightly rumpled from his stealthy journey through the castle corridors. "Your Highness," Mrs. Patterson said, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron, "what brings you to my kitchen?" Prince George explained in his earnest way that he wanted to help the guard who was standing in the rain. He asked if she could prepare something warm, perhaps tea and soup, that might comfort the man during his long, wet shift. Mrs. Patterson was touched by the prince's compassion, but explained the strict protocols about guards not eating or drinking while on duty. The prince listened carefully, then asked a question that surprised the cook. "But what about after his duty? Could we have something ready for when he finishes?" Mrs. Patterson agreed, understanding that this small act of kindness was teaching the young royal an important lesson about caring for others, regardless of their station in life. Meanwhile, William was struggling more than usual to maintain his composure. The combination of the cold rain, his worry about his mother, and the memory of the prince's kind presence was creating an emotional storm inside him. For the first time in his military career, he found himself questioning not just his immediate duties, but the entire structure of service that demanded he sacrifice his family's needs for the sake of tradition. As the afternoon wore on, the rain intensified, turning the castle grounds into a series of puddles and streams. Visitors hurried past the guard post seeking shelter, but William remained motionless. His dedication to duty was absolute, even as his personal world was crumbling. The latest medical update about his mother indicated that she would need months of care, not weeks. The doctors were recommending that family members take turns staying with her, as her recovery would be slow and potentially complicated. Prince George spent the rest of his day planning. He researched guard protocols in the castle library, asked careful questions of the staff about how the guards were cared for, and even wrote a letter to his father about the importance of showing appreciation for the people who served their family. The boy's natural intelligence was focused entirely on understanding how he could help someone who had touched his heart without speaking a single word. As evening approached, William's replacement arrived for the night shift. Sergeant Collins was a younger man who had always looked up to William as a mentor and example of perfect service. As they went through the formal change of guard ceremony, Collins noticed something different about his senior officer, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Everything all right, sir?" Collins asked quietly as they completed the handover. William paused, water dripping from his uniform, and for a moment considered sharing his burden. But protocol and years of training held his tongue. "All is well, Sergeant," he replied, though both men knew it wasn't entirely true. As William walked toward his quarters, his wet boots echoing in the stone corridors, he found something unexpected waiting outside his door. A thermos of hot soup still steaming sat beside a plate covered with a cloth napkin. Underneath was a small note written in a child's careful handwriting. "Thank you for keeping us safe in the rain. From a friend." The simple gesture broke something open in William's chest. Here was a young boy who would one day wear the crown, taking time to ensure that a common soldier had warm food after a miserable day in the rain. The prince had somehow understood that duty and kindness were not opposing forces, but could work together to create something beautiful and meaningful. That night, William sat in his small room, sipping the soup and reading his mother's letters by lamplight. The warmth spreading through his body wasn't just from the food, but from the realization that true service might sometimes require making difficult choices that honored both duty and love. The prince's quiet act of caring had shown him that real nobility lay not in blind obedience to tradition, but in the courage to act with compassion, even when it challenged the established order. As he prepared for sleep, William made a decision that had been building in his heart for days. Tomorrow he would request a meeting with his commanding officer. The time had come to choose between two kinds of duty, one that demanded he ignore his family's needs, and another that called him to honor the love and sacrifice that had shaped his character. The young prince's simple kindness had given him the clarity and courage to make that choice. The third day dawned clear and bright, with golden sunlight streaming through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle. Sergeant William Morrison had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the past 2 days like a film he couldn't stop watching. The thermos and note from Prince George sat on his nightstand, tangible proof that the encounter had been real and not just a product of his exhausted imagination. Prince George woke with an unusual sense of purpose for someone so young. He had spent the previous evening thinking about the guard and had come to a conclusion that surprised even himself. The man was sad because something important was happening in his life, something that required him to make a difficult choice. The prince didn't understand all the details, but his young heart recognized the weight of impossible decisions. William reported for his morning shift with a heavy heart, knowing that today he would take the first step toward ending his military career. He had requested a meeting with Colonel Matthews, his commanding officer, scheduled for immediately after his guard duty ended. The resignation letter in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, representing not just the end of a job, but the conclusion of a way of life that had defined him for nearly 2 decades. As William took his position at the East Gate, he noticed that Prince George was already in the gardens, this time accompanied by his younger sister, Princess Charlotte. The sight of the 2 royal children walking hand in hand toward his post filled him with a mixture of joy and sadness. Soon he would no longer be here to watch over them, to be part of the invisible network of protection that surrounded their innocent lives. Prince George had spent considerable time explaining to his 4-year-old sister about the guard who stood so still and looked so sad. Charlotte, with the boundless curiosity of a toddler, wanted to see this remarkable person for herself. She peppered her brother with questions. Why doesn't he move? Why does he look sad? Can we talk to him? Does he have children like us? When the children reached the guard post, Charlotte stared up at William with wide eyes, fascinated by his tall hat and shiny buttons. But Prince George was studying the man's face again, noting the new lines of worry that seemed to have appeared overnight. The prince had an intuitive understanding that today was important, that something was about to change in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. William fought to maintain his professional composure as the two children stood before him. Princess Charlotte's innocent wonder and Prince George's quiet concern created a powerful emotional contrast that threatened to overwhelm his carefully controlled facade. These children represented everything pure and good about the world he had dedicated his life to protecting. Yet they were also unknowing witnesses to his internal struggle. The prince made another decision that would have surprised the palace staff. He began talking to the guard, not expecting a response but somehow knowing that the man needed to hear what he had to say. In his clear young voice, Prince George began sharing stories about his day, his lessons, his pets, and his family. He spoke about the rain from yesterday and how he had worried about the guard getting cold and wet. "My great-grandmother used to tell me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," the prince said, his small voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. "She said it means you do what's right even when it's really hard." "I think you're very brave." William's throat tightened as he listened to the boy's words. How could this child possibly understand the exact thing he needed to hear? The prince's innocent observation about bravery cut straight to the heart of William's dilemma. Was it braver to stay and maintain tradition or to leave and care for his mother? The question had been torturing him for days. Princess Charlotte, growing bored with her brother's serious conversation, began dancing around the guard post, her small shoes tapping on the stones. She hummed a little song their nanny had taught them, creating a melody that seemed to lighten the heavy atmosphere. Her carefree joy provided a counterpoint to the weight of the moment, reminding everyone present that life contained both serious responsibilities and simple pleasures. As the morning progressed, other members of the palace staff began to notice the unusual scene at the east gate. The children's nanny appeared, initially concerned about their unsupervised interaction with the guard, but something about the peaceful nature of the gathering made her pause. She watched from a distance, recognizing that something meaningful was happening. Even if she couldn't understand exactly what it was, Prince George continued his one-sided conversation, telling the guard about his studies and his dreams for the future. He spoke about wanting to help people when he grew up, about learning to be kind like his great-grandmother had been, and about the importance of family. Each word seemed carefully chosen, as if the young prince understood that his words were reaching someone who desperately needed to hear them. The boy then did something that broke every protocol in the royal handbook. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small toy soldier, one of his favorites from his collection. Looking up at the real soldier before him, Prince George carefully placed the toy at the base of the guard post. "This is for you," he said simply, "so you know that someone thinks you're important." William's eyes fixed on the small toy soldier, a perfect miniature of himself in his red uniform. The gesture was so pure, so innocent, and so deeply meaningful that it shattered the last of his resistance to the emotions he had been fighting. A single tear rolled down his cheek, invisible to most observers but noticed by the perceptive young prince. The children were eventually called away for their lessons, but before leaving, Prince George looked directly into William's eyes and said something that would echo in the guard's mind for the rest of his life. "Sometimes the bravest thing is choosing love." The words came from somewhere deep within the child's soul, as if he had been given a message to deliver without fully understanding its importance. As the children disappeared into the castle, William stood alone with the toy soldier at his feet, and profound words echoing in his mind. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his face and illuminating the path forward with startling clarity. The prince's gift and words had given him something he hadn't expected to find: peace with his decision and confidence that choosing to care for his mother was indeed an act of bravery, not cowardice. The hours until his meeting with Colonel Matthews seemed to pass both quickly and slowly. William found himself thinking not about the career he was ending, but about the new chapter he was beginning. The young prince had shown him that true service could take many forms, and that honor could be found in caring for family just as surely as in standing guard at palace gates. The afternoon meeting with Colonel Matthews took place in the officers' quarters, a room lined with military honors and photographs spanning decades of royal service. William Morrison sat across from his commanding officer, the resignation letter in his hand trembling slightly, as he prepared to speak words that would change everything. Colonel Matthews, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, sensed the gravity of the moment before William even began. "Sir," William began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say, "I am here to submit my resignation from the Royal Guard, effective immediately." He placed the letter on the polished wooden desk between them, the paper seeming to glow white against the dark wood surface. Colonel Matthews picked up the letter but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he studied William's face, noting the exhaustion and emotional strain that even the most disciplined soldier couldn't completely hide. "Sergeant Morrison," he said slowly, "in 20 years of service, you have never so much as requested a single day of leave. This is rather unexpected." William explained his mother's situation, the surgery, the long recovery, and his role as her only child. He spoke of duty to family versus duty to the crown, and how the two had come into irreconcilable conflict. As he talked, he found himself mentioning the young prince's words about bravery and choosing love, though he wasn't sure why those conversations seemed so relevant to his military decision. The colonel listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When William finished, there was a long silence filled only by the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Colonel Matthews opened the resignation letter and read it carefully, his eyebrows rising slightly at the formal language and obvious thought that had gone into its composition. "This is well written, Sergeant," the colonel said finally, "but I'm not going to accept it." William's heart skipped. "Sir, what you're describing isn't a conflict between duty and family," Colonel Matthews continued. "It's a conflict between two different kinds of duty. The Royal Guard exists to protect what matters most: family, tradition, love, honor. If we ask our soldiers to abandon those very things in service of the crown, we become something hollow and meaningless." The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the castle grounds. In the distance, they could see the east gate where William had stood for so many years. "I'm going to offer you something unprecedented," he said. "Extended compassionate leave. 6 months with full pay to care for your mother. Your position will be held for you. When you're ready to return, we'll be here." William was stunned. In all his years of service, he had never heard of such an arrangement. "Sir, the regulations," Colonel Matthews interrupted, "serve the institution, not the other way around. Sometimes leadership means knowing when to bend the rules for a greater good. Your mother raised a son who has served this family with distinction for 2 decades. The least we can do is ensure she receives the care she needs." As word of the colonel's decision spread through the castle staff, it created ripples of surprise and eventually deep respect. The other guards were amazed that their rigid military structure could show such flexibility and humanity. The palace staff whispered about it in the corridors, many of them thinking of their own family members and feeling grateful to serve an institution that could demonstrate such understanding. Prince George learned about the guard's situation through the complex network of castle communication that somehow always reached the royal children's ears. When he understood that the man would be leaving to care for his sick mother, the prince felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. He was sad because he had grown fond of the quiet guardian, but satisfied because he sensed that this was the right thing to happen. That evening, the prince convinced his nanny to let him visit the guard's quarters. This was highly unusual, as the royal children rarely ventured into the staff areas of the castle. But something about the boy's earnest determination persuaded her to make an exception. They found William packing his few belongings, preparing for the journey to Yorkshire the next morning. The sight of the young prince in his simple quarters surprised William greatly. The boy looked around the Spartan room with curiosity, taking in the single bed, the small desk, and the photographs of William's mother that adorned the walls. Prince George studied these pictures with interest, seeing the resemblance between the elderly woman and the soldier who had stood guard over his family. "She looks kind," the prince said, pointing to a photo of William's mother in her garden, smiling despite her obvious age and frailty. "I think she must be very proud of you." William knelt down to the prince's level, meeting the child's eyes directly for the first time. "Your Highness," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that your kindness these past few days has meant more to me than you could possibly understand. You helped me find the courage to make the right choice." Prince George considered this seriously. his young mind processing the idea that his simple acts of standing nearby and leaving soup could have such profound effects. "Will you come back?" he asked. "I hope so," William replied honestly. "When my mother is better, I would be honored to return to my duties here." The prince nodded solemnly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out another small toy soldier, this one in a different uniform. "This one is for your mother," he said, "so she knows that a prince thinks she's brave too." The gesture broke down the last of William's emotional defenses. He accepted the toy with hands that shook slightly, understanding that this child had given him something far more valuable than a small plastic figure. The prince had given him validation, understanding, and the knowledge that his choice was not only acceptable but noble. As they said goodbye, Prince George did something that would become family legend. He hugged the soldier, a breach of protocol so complete and so heartfelt that even his nanny couldn't bring herself to intervene. In that embrace, years of rigid formality melted away, replaced by simple human connection between a child who would one day be king and a man who had devoted his life to service. The next morning, as William prepared to leave Windsor Castle, he found a small crowd gathered to see him off. His fellow guards stood at attention in an unofficial honor formation, while various palace staff members had come to wish him well. Colonel Matthews himself appeared, shaking William's hand and repeating his promise that a position would be waiting upon his return. "Prince," George watched from his bedroom window as the car, carrying Sergeant Morrison, disappeared down the long driveway. The boy felt proud that he had somehow helped make this important thing happen, though he didn't fully understand the broader implications of what had occurred. He only knew that the sad guard was going to help his mother, and that felt right and good in a way that made his young heart sing with satisfaction. The ripple effects of this unprecedented decision were just beginning to be felt throughout the institution, marking the start of a quiet revolution in how the royal household balanced duty, tradition, and human compassion. 3 weeks had passed since Sergeant William Morrison left Windsor Castle, and the impact of his departure was being felt in ways no one had anticipated. The story of the guard who was granted unprecedented leave to care for his mother had spread throughout the royal household, creating conversations about duty, family, and the human cost of service that had never been openly discussed before. Prince George found himself thinking about William frequently. The toy soldier that had been left at the guard post was gone, carefully preserved by the palace staff as a reminder of the unusual events that had unfolded. The prince often asked his nanny about the guard's mother, wondering if she was getting better and whether William was happy taking care of her. In Yorkshire, William was discovering a different kind of service entirely. His mother's cottage, surrounded by rolling green hills and stone walls, had become his new post. Instead of standing guard with a rifle, he was learning to help with physical therapy exercises, managing medications, and providing the kind of emotional support that no amount of military training had prepared him for. Mrs. Morrison, despite her pain and limited mobility, was thriving under her son's care. The woman who had raised him alone after his father's death was finally receiving the attention and devotion she had always deserved. William read to her in the evenings, cooked simple meals, and listened to stories from her childhood that he had never heard before. The small toy soldier from Prince George sat on her bedside table, a source of endless fascination and pride. "A real prince gave you this?" she would ask, holding the tiny figure with wonder. "And he said I was brave?" William would smile and repeat the story, watching his mother's eyes light up with each telling. The prince's simple gesture had given her something precious, the knowledge that her sacrifice and William's service were recognized and appreciated by the very family they had served. Back at Windsor Castle, the other guards were experiencing a shift in their own understanding of their roles. Sergeant Collins, who had looked up to William as a mentor, found himself thinking differently about the balance between duty and personal life. The rigid structure that had once seemed absolute was revealed to have flexibility, and this knowledge changed how the guards viewed their own service. Colonel Matthews was fielding inquiries from other military units about the precedent he had set. Some criticized his decision as too lenient, arguing that it would undermine discipline and tradition. Others praised it as a progressive step toward recognizing the human needs of military personnel. The colonel found himself defending his choice in meetings with superior officers, but he remained convinced that he had made the right decision. Prince George's parents, Prince William and Catherine, had learned about their son's role in the events through the castle staff. The story of their young son's compassion and wisdom had moved them deeply. They realized that George was developing the kind of emotional intelligence and empathy that would serve him well as a future king. He understood something that many adults miss. Catherine observed to her husband as they watched their children playing in the garden. That true leadership means caring for the people who serve you, not just expecting their service. The prince himself was experiencing his own growth. The successful outcome of his intervention with the guard had given him confidence in his ability to help others. He began paying closer attention to the castle staff, noticing small signs of stress or sadness that he might have missed before. His acts of kindness became more frequent and more thoughtful. One afternoon, Prince George convinced his tutors to include letter writing in his lessons. His first letter was to William, though he needed help with some of the spelling and grammar. In his careful handwriting, he asked about William's mother, shared news about his lessons and his pets, and expressed hope that they would see each other again soon. The letter arrived at the Yorkshire cottage on a particularly difficult day. William's mother had experienced a setback in her recovery, and both she and William were feeling discouraged. The sight of the royal crest on the envelope brightened the entire afternoon. Mrs. Morrison insisted that William read the letter aloud 3 times, and she asked him to help her compose a response. Her letter to the prince was dictated with the formality of someone who had lived through an era when royalty seemed impossibly distant, but it was filled with genuine warmth and gratitude. She thanked Prince George for his kindness to her son, and for the toy soldier, which she treasured as a symbol of recognition from the royal family she had always respected. The correspondence between the prince and the Morrison family created an unprecedented situation in the royal household. Never before had a member of the royal family maintained personal communication with a serving soldier and his family. The palace secretaries weren't sure how to handle the situation, but Prince William and Catherine decided to allow it to continue, recognizing its value in their son's education about leadership and compassion. As weeks turned into months, William's mother gradually improved. The surgery had been successful, and with dedicated care and physical therapy, she was regaining her strength and mobility. William found himself changed by the experience of caregiving. The patience, gentleness, and emotional availability required to care for his mother had taught him new ways of understanding service and dedication. The reports that Colonel Matthews received about William's situation were consistently positive. The local doctor praised William's dedication to his mother's care, and neighbors spoke of his helpfulness and integration into the community. It became clear that the leave arrangement was working exactly as intended, allowing a good soldier to fulfill his family obligations while maintaining his connection to his military career. Other members of the royal staff began approaching their supervisors about their own family situations. The precedent set by William's case had opened a door that had been closed for generations. Requests for flexible schedules to care for elderly parents, attend children's important events, or deal with family emergencies were suddenly being considered rather than automatically denied. Prince George's birthday approached, and he made an unusual request. Instead of the typical elaborate celebration, he asked if William and his mother could be invited to the castle for tea. The request surprised everyone, but after careful consideration, Prince William and Catherine agreed. The invitation was extended, and despite her initial nervousness about traveling, Mrs. Morrison was determined not to miss the opportunity to meet the young prince who had shown such kindness to her son. The planned visit would mark a significant moment in royal history. The first time a serving soldier's family member had been personally invited to dine with the royal family as a gesture of appreciation and friendship. The invitation represented not just a social occasion, but a recognition of the new understanding of service and humanity that had emerged from Prince George's simple acts of compassion. As the date of the visit approached, anticipation grew throughout the castle. The staff prepared for what everyone sensed would be a meaningful and historic occasion, one that would further cement the changes that had begun with a young prince's quiet observation of a sad guard standing in the rain. The day of the visit arrived with autumn painting the castle grounds in brilliant golds and reds. Mrs. Morrison had spent weeks preparing for this unprecedented invitation, carefully selecting her best dress and practicing the proper way to address royalty. William helped her into the car that would take them back to Windsor Castle, both of them nervous and excited about the extraordinary occasion ahead. Prince George had been counting down the days until William's return. The correspondence between them had created a friendship that transcended their different stations in life, and the prince was eager to meet the woman who had raised such a good and loyal man. He had also been learning about Mrs. Morrison's life through their letters, discovering that she had worked as a seamstress for many years and had a garden that she loved dearly. As their car approached the castle gates, Mrs. Morrison gasped at the sight of the imposing structure where her son had served for so many years. She had imagined it countless times through William's descriptions, but seeing it in person was overwhelming. The guards at the gate, William's former colleagues, saluted respectfully as they passed through, a gesture that brought tears to both visitors' eyes. The reunion between Prince George and William took place in the castle's private family quarters, away from the formal staterooms. The prince ran to greet the guard he had missed so much, and William knelt down to receive what had become their traditional embrace. The formality that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by genuine affection and mutual respect. Mrs. Morrison watched this interaction with wonder, still struggling to believe that a member of the royal family had formed such a bond with her son. When Prince George turned his attention to her, approaching with the careful politeness he had been taught but also with genuine warmth, she felt her nervousness begin to melt away. "Mrs. Morrison," the prince said, executing a perfect small bow, "I'm so happy to meet you. William talks about you all the time in his letters. How is your leg feeling?" The elderly woman was charmed by the boy's directness and obvious sincerity. "Much better, Your Highness, thanks to your son's excellent care and your kind encouragement." She had brought a small gift, a hand-knitted scarf in the colors of the Royal Guard, which she presented to the prince with trembling hands. Prince, William and Catherine joined them for afternoon tea, an event that would have been unthinkable under previous royal protocols. The conversation was warm and natural, with Mrs. Morrison sharing stories about William's childhood and the royal couple discussing their own experiences as parents. Prince George served as an enthusiastic bridge between the adults, ensuring that everyone felt included and comfortable. The most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Morrison presented Prince George with something she had been working on during her recovery. It was a carefully embroidered handkerchief featuring the royal crest, created with the skill of someone who had spent decades working with needle and thread. The quality was exceptional, each stitch perfect despite the limitations of her healing hands. "I wanted to make something beautiful for the prince who showed such kindness to my William," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not much, but it was made with a grateful heart." Prince George accepted the gift with solemnity, understanding instinctively that he was receiving something far more valuable than its material worth. The handkerchief represented hours of careful work, love for her son, and appreciation for his gesture. He promised to treasure it always, and his parents could see that he meant every word. During tea, William updated Colonel Matthews about his mother's progress and expressed his desire to return to duty. The colonel, who had been invited to join them, confirmed that William's position was waiting for him and that his leave had been viewed as a complete success by all parties involved. "Your son's situation has helped us understand something important," Colonel Matthews told Mrs. Morrison. "Military service is most meaningful when it supports the values we're defending. Family, love, sacrifice, and care for others. William's dedication to you has made him a better soldier, not a lesser one." The conversation turned to the broader changes that had taken place at the castle during William's absence. Other staff members had been granted similar considerations for family emergencies, creating a more humane and flexible working environment. The precedent set by William's case had rippled throughout the royal household, influencing policies and attitudes in ways that would benefit future generations of royal staff. Prince George listened to these adult conversations with interest, beginning to understand that his simple act of kindness had created changes much larger than he had imagined. The concept that small gestures could have far-reaching consequences was a lesson that would stay with him for life, shaping his understanding of leadership and responsibility. As the afternoon progressed, William was invited to inspect his former post at the East Gate. Walking through the familiar corridors in civilian clothes felt strange, but the warm greetings from his former colleagues made it clear that his absence had been felt, and his return was welcomed. The current guard on duty, a young man William had helped train, stood a little straighter when he saw his mentor approaching. Mrs. Morrison was given a tour of the castle gardens, supported by Prince George, who had insisted on serving as her personal guide. They walked slowly through the paths where he had first noticed her son's sadness, and she marveled at the beauty of the grounds that William had helped protect for so many years. He was always such a serious boy, she told the prince as they sat on a bench, overlooking the East Gate. Even as a child, he felt responsible for taking care of everyone. I worried that he gave too much of himself to others and kept too little for himself. Prince George considered this thoughtfully. I think caring for others makes people stronger, not weaker, he said with the wisdom that continued to surprise the adults around him. William became better at taking care of everyone when he learned to take care of you too. As the visit drew to a close, there was an emotional farewell between Prince George and Mrs. Morrison. The elderly woman had been deeply moved by the young prince's maturity and kindness, while the prince had gained a new understanding of the sacrifices made by the families of those who serve. William's official return to duty was scheduled for the following week, but the changes his absence had created were permanent. The royal household had evolved into something more flexible and humane, while maintaining all of its traditions and standards of excellence. The evening ended with Prince George presenting William with a formal letter of commendation, written in his careful script and signed with great ceremony. The letter praised William's service to the crown and his devotion to his family, officially recognizing that both forms of duty were equally valuable and admirable. As the Morrisons prepared to leave, taking with them memories of an extraordinary day, Prince George made one final gesture. He asked William to accept a permanent position as his personal guard when he came of age, ensuring that their friendship would continue into the future. It was an unprecedented offer that honored both their past connection and their shared future in service to the crown. 5 years had passed since that rainy day when Prince George first noticed the sad guard at the East Gate. The young prince, now 12 years old, had grown into a thoughtful and compassionate young man, whose early lessons in leadership and empathy had shaped his character in profound ways. The story of his kindness to Sergeant Morrison had become part of castle legend, but more importantly, it had fundamentally changed how the royal household operated. William Morrison had returned to his duties as promised, but to a transformed workplace. The rigid protocols that had once governed every aspect of royal service had evolved to include considerations for the human needs of staff members. The Morrison precedent, as it came to be known, had established new guidelines for compassionate leave, family emergencies, and work-life balance that benefited hundreds of royal employees. Mrs. Morrison had made a full recovery and lived independently again, though William visited her every weekend without fail. The toy soldier Prince George had given her remained on her mantelpiece, polished and treasured as a symbol of the remarkable friendship that had changed her family's life. She often told neighbors about the day she had tea with the royal family, an experience that had become the highlight of her elderly years. The correspondence between Prince George and the Morrison family had continued and deepened over the years. What had begun as simple thank-you notes had evolved into a genuine friendship that crossed social boundaries in ways that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. The prince learned about ordinary life through their letters, while they gained insight into the responsibilities and challenges of royal duty. Colonel Matthews had retired the previous year, but not before implementing comprehensive policy changes based on the lessons learned from William's case. His successor, Colonel Elizabeth Harper, was chosen partly because of her commitment to maintaining the balance between military discipline and human compassion that had become the new standard for the Royal Guard. The broader impact of Prince George's intervention extended far beyond the castle walls. News of the changes in royal staff policies had reached other military and government organizations, inspiring similar reforms. The idea that rigid institutional loyalty and family devotion could coexist rather than conflict had gained acceptance in circles where such flexibility had never been considered. Prince George himself had grown into his role as future king with a deep understanding of servant leadership that distinguished him from previous generations of royals. His tutors noted his exceptional ability to see situations from multiple perspectives and his natural inclination to seek solutions that honored both duty and human dignity. The young prince had also developed a reputation for noticing staff members who seemed troubled or stressed. His interventions were always subtle and respectful, but consistently effective. Whether it was ensuring a homesick footman received extra time off to visit family or arranging for medical care for a gardener's injured wife, Prince George had learned to use his position to solve problems rather than simply command obedience. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Prince George arranged for a special ceremony at the East Gate. William, now promoted to staff sergeant, was officially recognized for his years of dedicated service, but the ceremony was also intended to honor all royal staff members who balanced duty with family responsibilities. The ceremony took place on a beautiful spring morning, with the same gentle breeze that had rustled the leaves on that first meaningful day. Mrs. Morrison, now walking with only a slight limp, was present as the guest of honor. She wore the dress she had saved for special occasions, and carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew she was deeply respected and valued. Prince William and Catherine attended the ceremony, along with Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, who had heard the story many times and understood its significance to their family's values. The presence of the entire family emphasized that the lessons learned from Prince George's childhood intervention had become part of the royal family's philosophy of service. As Prince George spoke at the ceremony, his words reflected the wisdom he had gained through 5 years of reflection on leadership and compassion. True service, he said, is not about choosing between loyalty to institution and loyalty to family. It's about understanding that the best institutions support their people in honoring both commitments. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a small plaque at the East Gate, commemorating the importance of compassion in service. The inscription read, "In recognition of all who serve with both dedication and humanity, understanding that true strength comes from honoring both duty and love." William was deeply moved by the recognition, but even more touched by the knowledge that his personal struggle had helped create positive change for others. In his brief speech, he thanked Prince George for seeing him as a person, rather than just a uniformed figure, and for having the wisdom and courage to act on that recognition. Mrs. Morrison was invited to speak, and her words brought tears to many eyes. "My son taught me about service," she said, "but Prince George taught us both about leadership. A true leader doesn't just command. He cares. He doesn't just expect loyalty. He earns it through kindness." The afternoon concluded with a private lunch where old friends could catch up without the formality of public ceremonies. Prince George, now tall for his age and bearing an increasing resemblance to his father, sat between William and Mrs. Morrison, continuing conversations that had enriched all their lives for 5 years. The impact of that long-ago rainy day continued to ripple outward. Other military organizations had adopted similar compassionate leave policies. Business leaders had studied the royal household's approach to balancing institutional needs with employee welfare. Academic papers had been written about the Windsor model of leadership that prioritized both efficiency and humanity. But perhaps the most significant change was in Prince George himself. The 7-year-old boy who had instinctively understood that a sad guard needed kindness had grown into a young man who approached every challenge with empathy and wisdom. His future subjects would benefit from a king who learned early that true power comes from lifting others up rather than commanding their submission. As the sun set over Windsor Castle that evening, Prince George stood at the East Gate where it all began. The current guard on duty was a young woman whose own family had benefited from the new policies, and she smiled gratefully as the prince acknowledged her service with a respectful nod. The toy soldier that had started everything was now displayed in a place of honor in the Castle Museum, part of an exhibit about the evolution of royal service. But the real monument to that moment of childhood compassion was not made of plastic or bronze. It was built from changed lives, reformed policies, and a new understanding that the strongest institutions are those that honor the humanity of the people they serve. Prince George walked back toward the castle, knowing that the lessons learned from a simple act of kindness would guide him throughout his life and reign. The future king had learned the most important lesson of leadership, that seeing and responding to human need is not a distraction from duty, but the very essence of it.